Thanks, Dennis, and it's good to see so many people here. You've all got an interest in birds, and I see a number of familiar faces out there, people that I've worked with at one time or another over the last number of years. So we are going to talk about quite the diversity of birds that are in the IRL, and as Dennis said, I've had the good opportunity to work for a number of governmental clients and other entities on the conservation side of the whole consultancy side of things. So one of the interesting projects that I have had, he mentioned the piping plovers. And specifically, that I've had a couple of those different projects in different counties. One was up at Ponce Inlet. Another was at St. Lucie Inlet. We're going to talk a little bit about piping plovers when we get to that portion of the show here. But I put together a number of slides for you, mostly slides that I've taken over the years. I think although I've got the training in the biological sciences, I really found that photography to be a hobby, and it helps me to demonstrate these kinds of things that we're talking about, and I think hopefully it'll make it come alive to you as well. So I've got some slides that hopefully will be both educational and entertaining, and if we can learn both about birds and the IRL, we will have done what a lot of people talk about, which is kill two birds with, we're not going to do that tonight. First, though, just to talk about the overall diversity of birds, the reason that the birds come to the IRL is because we have so many different nuances of habitat type. Certainly the open water areas, there are certain birds that we see in those locations. Other species, the shorebirds that are along the mangrove shorelines and the sandy tidal flats and that sort of thing. But it's that diversity of habitats, and for the whole 156 miles of the lagoon, the variety of habitats at different areas that makes it very attractive for a variety of species of birds. Birding can be very inexpensive and easy if you like just going to the beach and watching that flock of pelicans soar along the beach. That's a great way to be entertained. Likewise, the cattle egret, you see one perched there on the car if you like the antics of the birds in the urban areas. It can be a very easy hobby. All you really need is a $20 bird book, and if you want a $100 pair of binoculars and a little bit of interest in the outdoors, you can enjoy birds anywhere. It can, on the other hand, be a very challenging and expensive hobby. If you want to go to unusual locations, kind of out of the way, or if you're searching for individual species of birds, such as, that's one of those little piping plovers over there on the right. But before we get into specifically the birds here in the IRL, let's just kind of frame the whole bird discussion. So thousands of species of birds worldwide, 750 to 800 here in North America, about 500, a little bit more than that in Florida. And nobody's actually ever compiled a list that I have ever seen for the Indian River Lagoon. Some of the Audubon chapters do have lists for specific counties or their own territories, but I haven't seen a list for the IRL. So it's kind of interesting in preparing for this to look at the different databases and see what we see where. Let's talk a little bit about the diversity of birds that we get. We'll first talk about the diversity as far as their size goes. Everything from that bald eagle that has a 70 to 90-inch wingspread. So that is further apart than my fingertip to fingertip. It's a very impressive bird when you see it up close. So if that's the biggest bird that we've got, what do you think the smallest one is? Any ideas? Little hummers, absolutely. And we're finding out a lot more these days about hummingbirds. We used to think there was only one species that would come this far south in Florida with any regularity, the ruby throat. But we're actually, through a variety of surveys, finding out that there are several other species. So there's the size there, and it's small enough that it'll sit in the palm of your hand. And I found a hummingbird nest once made up of spider webs and little lichens and mosses and things like that. Pretty impressive. We'll talk also a little bit about the diversity of birds as far as their color goes. Something as bright white as the snowy egret, something as beautiful as a roseate spoonbill. I saw the Gordons come in back there in the back. One of our folks who monitor and have painted buntings come to their feeder down on Jupiter Island. And then on the opposite side of all those brightly colorful birds are The LBJs. Who knows what an LBJ is? Little brown jobs, that's right. Yeah. If you really get into it, they're usually wrens or one kind of warbler or another, but even the birders get stymied at times. But it's kind of interesting because you can actually identify some of these birds by the lack of those visual characteristics. No wing bars, no eye stripes, no patch on the top of the head. Those are all the different things that help us identify the birds. We'll also talk a little bit about the diversity of birds as far as their diet goes. And you see the list of the different kind of major categories. And to one extent or another, some birds are only seed eaters or only meat eaters, one thing or another. But overall, as many of you who might be biologists know, there are lumpers and splitters. And so if you really want to look at the details there of the seed eaters and so on, you can. But overall, the lumpers would say there are generalist birds like ring-billed gulls. They aren't particular at all. They'll eat that soggy McDonald's French fry or pieces of bread. Might not be good for them, but they'll eat it. And on the opposite side of that, there are specialists, such as this bird here, the snail kite. The only thing in the world this bird eats is escargot. Happens to be a freshwater snail, the apple snail. And I guess it's a little bit of a stretch to have this in my IRL presentation. I haven't ever actually seen one in the IRL because the apple snail is a freshwater snail. It's usually in those inland lakes, isolated ponds, and that sort of thing. But the first snail kite I ever saw was in the savannas, which is this waterway, this mosaic of habitats right within a mile or two of the lagoon. So as I talk about birds of the IRL, this is going to be including the watershed around it. Let's talk a little bit about the difference of birds in the IRL as far as their abundance goes. Certainly there are very common birds like the great blue heron. There are species that are a little bit less common or uncommon, like the yellow-crowned night heron. And it might be that, although their numbers aren't as high as great blue herons, they have very secretive habitat, often kind of skulking around down there under the mangroves, and they are night herons. They feed at night, so they're often not out in obvious locations during the daytime. And then we go to species that are indeed very rare, such as this one, the reddish egret. Species that, there's maybe in the total IRL watershed, maybe a dozen nesting pairs of that species. So if you're going to go looking for that, you need to be looking in just the right area. We'll talk a little bit about the diversity of birds as far as their residential status goes. You may remember a graphic like this back from high school biology. At that time, we were told there was a central flyway and a western flyway and an eastern flyway of birds. But we know a lot more now about bird movement as a result of a variety of banding studies and satellite transmitters and that sort of thing. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the residential status of some of the individuals here. And you see the different categories that I've got here. There are some birds that are year-round residents, and mockingbirds and great blue herons are great examples of that. That mockingbird that they're starting to sing right now, does anybody have them singing in your yard at like 3 o'clock in the morning? They know, just like the woodpeckers know when they're tapping on something metal, that's all a sign of courtship, and they're getting into defending territories. So when that mockingbird is singing at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, it's because everything is so still. That call is going out over a much wider area, and so that's probably the male bird, and he's advertising that this is his territory. So it's the same bird in your backyard today as it's going to be there next month and 6 months from now. They don't migrate at all. Same sort of thing with great blue herons. Not the way it is with birds like the little sanderlings. These are the guys over there at the beach, little bill going up and down like a sewing machine right at the water's edge. Here's the range map for sanderlings. And let me make sure I got the right light here. You know, we're down here, we're seeing them in the wintertime. The breeding area for that bird is way up here in the Arctic tundra. So these are birds that are migrating thousands of miles every year, which is a pretty impressive feat for a bird that it could sit in the palm of your hand and probably weighs about as much as a quarter. They're doing that migration back and forth every year. One of the other kinds of migrants that is here during the wintertime, that collectively we call them snowbirds, and that's why they're here when it's snowing up north. The insects that the warblers are eating, they're not available. They're just not there. So warblers are one of the groups of species that we see often arriving here in the fall and staying through the winter and then heading back up north. So the map, and I've got several range maps in the presentation here. So blue is the wintertime range for the palm warbler here. In the red, you can see they're migrating way up and nesting up across most of Canada. If you think about the diet of some of the birds, you'll understand why they are indeed migrating those thousands of miles. I've got the red-breasted merganser there. This is a fish eater. And if you're nesting on the lakes up in Minnesota or Wisconsin or into Canada, those lakes, they're frozen over now, so you're going to starve. So the birds are migrating south to get those fish. Same thing with a lot of the hawks. They're migrants as well. We've got some species that are year-round residents here, but many of them are rodent eaters. And if you got a foot or two of snow, it's going to be hard pickings to find a little mouse or a rat or something like that. There are some birds that we think have sort of a backwards migration. They've been down in Central and South America for the last several months, and they're just starting to arrive back up here for their summertime nesting season. So I've got examples of some of these here, purple martins, and those are actually on a nest box that I put up at a project site down in Palm Beach County. We had the box up for a couple years, but the birds have finally come to it, and we're hoping they're going to nest consecutively. Last year was the first year that they nested there. Least terns are another one. They're just arriving. They got back maybe 3 weeks or so ago, and they'll be here through the summer. Now, some of them do go much further north. They'll nest as far up as Maine, but certainly we'll see them around here all summer long. Then I've got this category of migrants as far as the residential status go. These are the birds that are really the most difficult for the birders to really get to know because they're not really here for very long of a period. We see them for maybe 2 weeks or so in the fall as they're migrating through. They don't winter here. They just pass through. They're going down to Central or South America. They'll be there for all winter long. And then we see them again in the northerly passage for maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or even a month. This is a little blackpoll warbler that you see him sitting in some sea oats over there on the beach here. I was doing a bird survey in Indian River County. This is probably a year or two ago. And I would have never thought you'd see a blackpoll warbler on the beach. It just doesn't fit with the right kind of habitat. But as these birds are going through and the weather's changing and all that sort of thing, I've learned that as far as birds go, you never say never. They can surprise you. Another category here are, I put in accidentals and escapees. We used to just call them accidentals, the birds that would come in on a storm or they got lost one way or another every now and then. Well, we got a puffin down on Jupiter Island a couple years ago, kind of an unusual thing. Well, this picture was sent to me electronically a couple years ago. They said, this was in Palm City down in Martin County, and the person said, do you know this bird? I've looked through all my bird books. I can't figure out what it is. Do you have any idea? Does the bird look familiar to anybody in here? Somebody over here? It is a goldfinch. What kind of a goldfinch is it? European goldfinch. So we don't see them around here in the United States. I happen to know my wife is from Britain, and so I've done a lot of birding over there, and so I have seen this species, and I knew right away what it was. And I thought, wow, this is really a notable occurrence. It was a couple years ago. It was after the 2005. We had one of the hurricanes in the fall of 2005. So I thought, wow, this is really notable. I happened to get on the phone. I talked with a reporter from the Stuart News because as far as I knew, there hadn't been one of these birds seen in ages. So she got all excited about it. They put an article in the paper, European bird oddly hops the pond to Martin. Well, a week or so after this article rang, somebody called me on the phone very sheepishly and said, that was a caged bird, and it got out of my backyard, out of my screened-in enclosure. So there again, you never know. So that's kind of a primer for the diversity of birds that we've got. Let's go through, and I don't certainly have time to talk about all of them. We got over 200 species of birds here, but I'm going to go through the different categories. And those of you who are familiar with your bird books, sometimes it's kind of a mystery how they're set up. Well, they are by family. Birds by family. So we're going to talk about the gulls and the terns and that sort of thing. But we're going to start off with the Anhingas here, because I have to be impressed with any bird that can outswim a fish. And that's what these guys do. The only thing they eat are live fish. Well, they may take other marine life, but other swimming marine life. So you see the male on the left there with all the black, and the female has more of a tawny brown on her head and neck. They get the nickname snake bird because often when they're swimming around, the whole body is underwater and there's that long neck kind of going like this. You often see them in that characteristic pose. Both the Anhingas and the cormorants will do that, and it's because of their sort of adaptation here for being able to swim around underwater. Ducks and other birds, they have different sort of oils and a plumage arrangement so that they can't dive down. They bob right back up like a cork. Well, these guys can't do that. If you're swimming after a live fish, you got to be able to go down. Well, what that then means is their feathers get completely drenched. They are wet and they are heavy and they can't fly. So when you see them in this sort of a pose, they've crawled out or hopped up onto a branch. They're drying out long enough so that then they're light enough that they can fly. So I'm impressed with any bird that can outswim a fish, but I'll tell you, they don't read very well. Brown pelicans, we sort of take them for granted. We see so many of them around. We like to see them in their flocks as they're going down the beach. And you might notice that the bird on the upper right here has a band on its leg. We're increasingly on the lookout for bands of any species of birds, and there are different ways that different birds are banded. The biologists are recognizing that there's limited value in having a band that you can only read if you have a dead bird. So like that piping plover that had the orange and the green bands and flags and all that sort of thing. The idea behind that is without getting up where you're disturbing the bird with binoculars or a telescope, you can identify that sequence of bands and you can report it on in. So we take brown pelicans for granted in this sort of a pose, but did you ever think of what the pelican is doing as it dives down into the water? We hear that they collect all the fish in the water and then they kind of sieve the water out and they're left with the fish. Well, several years ago, National Geographic did a very interesting photo program to learn about how pelicans forage. And check this out. That's how that pouch is expanding as the bird has hit the water. And it's sort of an implosion that stuns the fish momentarily enough so that the bird can then indeed suck it up in its big gular pouch there. So there's another shot of it. You can see how much they can expand that pouch. Really impressive. So we see the brown pelicans around, but we also occasionally see white pelicans. These are birds that have nested way up in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming during the summertime. They migrate south during the winter. Most of them go to the Gulf Coast, Texas, and other states to the west. But a small percentage of the population comes to Florida. We do see them up at Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. And they're interesting because they don't dive like brown pelicans do. Instead, they tend to flock the fish together. And on some sort of unknown cue, when one of them says go, they all just open up their bills and try to scoop up the fish. It doesn't seem to me like it would be a very efficient way of doing it, but they're very successful at it. The birds are even bigger than our brown pelicans. So I mentioned in our 156 miles worth of the lagoon, the reason that we have the great diversity of other marine life is it's so long. We've got this combination of kind of temperate climate up to the north and subtropical climate down here further to the south. And a good bird species that indicates that is the Frigatebird. It's a species that we see down in Martin County over the Indian River Lagoon around the St. Lucie Inlet fairly frequently, but up in the more northern counties of the IRL, we very rarely see them. On the bird monitoring that I've done at this bird island, MC2, down in Martin County, we have been looking, hoping that we could indeed confirm nesting. We see males, we see females, we see juveniles, but so far there hasn't been any indication of nesting. But they're great birds to see. You know, very aerodynamic. These are birds that can sleep while they're flying. They just put those wings on lock and they're just up there circling around. Very impressive birds. Okay, so let's switch gears from some of those kind of water birds and seabirds to some of the birds that are probably the most visible of the whole IRL. Those are the herons and the egrets. We've got quite a variety of different species. We're not going to talk about all of them, but they are sometimes challenging. People will say, why doesn't that little blue grow up to be a great blue? Well, it doesn't happen that way. Different species. All of them having a slightly different plumage one way or another. So these are, for the most part, the gray ones. So I've got this slide, and indeed, bird identification can be challenging. You know, look at all those birds that from a distance, they look very similar. Overall white birds. And there are some ringers in here. For those of you who are good with your bird ID, you'll probably right away know the great egret here, and the snowy egret, also called the yellow slippers, up here because it's bright yellow feet. And this guy here, I already told you before, he was walking around on that car hood. That's a cattle egret. What about this one? Anybody know that one? It is another cattle egret. I heard it somewhere out there. This is a bird that changes its plumage during the breeding season. And some birds will do that. You know, some species it's different between the male and the female, but here it's an annual cycle where they get that breeding plumage. And so I mentioned the great egret here, and there's only a relatively minor difference between the bird over here on the right, but if you look at slightly heavier bill, and the key feature, though, is those yellow legs. I was teaching a bird identification course for Audubon a couple years ago, and I mentioned the great egret, and I mentioned the white morph of the great blue heron, and somebody said, I see those birds all the time. And I had to be a little bit skeptical. But sure enough, we did a field trip associated with this class, and she took me right to this bird. So there is this white morph of the great blue heron. They're typically seen down in the Florida Keys and in extreme South Florida. But it's one of those species that is expanding its range, and indeed we now have permanent residents of that species in Martin County, and I expect they're going to continue to move to the north as well. Okay, so I got one other sort of ringer for you here. Anybody know this one? Immature little blue, there we go, very good. This is one of those species that changes its plumage as it grows. So for the first 2 to 3 years of its life, the little blue looks exactly like this, and then it starts to get that mottled plumage, some blue and some gray and some white, until it turns completely blue. Yeah, I've got wood storks, and watch as this graphic changes from year to year to year here. This is the location of wood stork nesting colonies. And what we're seeing, most of you know, wood storks are endangered, and their nesting success is highly related to having the right water levels in the various isolated wetlands and ponds and lakes in the central part of the state. Well, as humanity has messed up the hydrological regime in so much of Florida, we have seen many of the historic nesting sites be abandoned entirely. Instead, the birds are moving to coastal sites, and that's what this graphic will show as you go through it here. You'll start seeing a lot more of them nesting in coastal areas. It's because as that tide is rising and falling, at least the birds are going to be guaranteed of some part of the tidal cycle being the right kind of depth for them to be able to forage effectively. I was doing this bird monitoring down at MC2, and one of the reasons that that particular island is so notable for bird nesting is because of the wood storks. They abandoned an interior nesting colony back in the 80s, and they moved over here to the coastal area, and now we've got anywhere from 30 to over 100 pairs of wood storks in any given year. It's kind of hard to do the monitoring just from going around the relatively small island. So I was able to also do some aerial photography and then kind of analyze those photos. So there's an idea of the nesting of wood storks, and intermixed in with those are some great egrets and other species as well. Okay, let's switch gears to talk about gulls for a minute. You see them out there on the docks in large numbers, and it really takes a view like over there on the right to be able to give you an idea that there really are several different species, and you can tell them apart. The way we distinguish the different species for gulls and terns is primarily by looking at the combination of the color and the length and the kind of shape of the bill and the color of the legs, and certainly the size there as well. So I've got a shot here that shows a comparison of the different species of gulls that we have here. And it's challenging for a lot of people because there are so many options, and there really are. I've got the years to maturity here, so just take a look at that. Many of these are 3 years or 4-year birds. So each year for the first 4 years of its life, it's going to have a different plumage. So add those all up, and any individual gull that you see out there at the beach could be any one of maybe 20 different options or opportunities. So it is challenging. For those of you who this might inspire you to get more into birds, what I recommend is this National Geographic bird book. It's the one that I carry with me. It's a little bit heavier, but it's because it will show like 6 or 8 different pictures of one individual species of bird. So it'll show it in all of its different annual plumages. The one gull that we're going to talk a little bit about is the laughing gull. It's the one that is the most common here and is a year-round resident. And you see it in its different plumages for the first couple years. And down there at the lower right is when it's getting into its breeding plumage. So we're just starting to see these now because they're summertime nesters. Similarly with terns, you see those pointy gray birds out there on the sandbar, and you say, yep, that's a tern. Well, it is challenging because there are several different species of those. And once again, put your binoculars on it or a telescope and you'll see that there really are differences. And you see some of them here, orange bill, black legs, black bill, orange legs. It takes that sort of an analysis to really figure out what the different species are. So we got about a half dozen different species of them as well. And for the most part, they're wintertime birds, although there are a couple of them that are here during the summertime nesting season. And the one that we're looking out for right now is the least tern. These are the ones that have just returned usually about the 3rd week of March. They returned from down south. They're here for their summertime nesting season. And historically, they have nested right out on the open sandy beaches. But as our beaches in South Florida and all the way up the coast really are getting more overrun with people and dogs and people driving on the beach and all that sort of thing, the birds have, interestingly enough, taken to nesting on rooftops. It is a challenging sort of habitat for them, but there's a picture of one that I got a number of years ago, and it sort of dispels the myth that most of us think about a female bird incubating eggs. Think of a bird nesting on a rooftop in July in Florida. She's actually standing up over those eggs, shading them out, keeping them from being cooked in the midday heat. And on one hand, it's been good that they are adaptable enough to go to rooftops. But on the other hand, the old tar and gravel rooftop is getting to be kind of an archaic system now. When people replace those, they replace them with something different. So while we once thought that this was going to provide some long-term habitat, it's actually not doing so well. So the birds are on the threatened list, and so there are certainly challenges for the long-term survival of that species. Not really a tern, but closely related to them are black skimmers. And I had to put one in because they're such fascinating birds as they're flying right over the water surface, taking the little fish that are right near the water surface. And impressive birds to see, and if you see that picture on the right, you usually think, boy, that's a nice big bill that the bird has. And you wonder, how could it slice through the water so well? Well, I happened to get a front-on view of one, and check out that bill. It is really like a knife. So, of course, they've got very little resistance as they're flying right there over the water. Well, let's switch gears a little bit to the waterfowl, ducks and geese, and there's a lot of different species. We don't have time to talk about them all, but we'll mention a few of them. Some of these are, many of the species of ducks that we have are migratory. They've been nesting up north during the summertime. Their ponds are frozen over, and they're down here for the wintertime. Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge is a great place for waterfowl during the wintertime. Occasionally, though, we see some unusual ducks and geese, and here's one, the Egyptian goose, that increasingly we're seeing, and I think it is indeed expanding its range. Often they're seen on golf courses, but we were unfortunately disappointed to find them nesting on this bird island. And so I did some research. When we first found them nesting, I actually published a paper because it was the first documented nesting of that species in Florida in the wild. They've been nesting on golf courses and places like that. So they're very territorial birds. And so the concern, like other invasive or non-native species, is that they're going to outcompete some of the local species. So we're seeing them around. You see the range map there on the left, completely different continent. You never know what you're going to see. Just a brief word about urban habitats. There are some birds, like those Egyptian geese and monk parakeets, Muscovy ducks, and that sort of thing, that do very well in urban areas. But we're increasingly seeing that a number of other native species do very well in urban kinds of settings. I've had a number of projects over the years to put up bird nest boxes. And so you see a little screech owl poking his head there out of a nest box. In our tidy community that we're in these days, everybody wants to take down a dead tree. Now, dead trees are great for birds, for woodpeckers, and the cavities in those dead trees provide habitat for a variety of species. So if you happen to live in a housing development that takes down every dead tree, put it in a nest box somewhere. Give those poor birds a little bit of habitat. Okay, let's switch gears to shorebirds, another very challenging group of birds to try to identify. So as you see a Webster definition here, there are birds of the shore and there are shorebirds. And we're going to look at a couple of the different sort of classes or subclasses of the shorebirds. So the oystercatchers and stilts and plovers, we're going to talk about one of those, the piping, that I think is a particularly interesting bird. But our most common shorebirds that we see around this area are the sanderling, seen there on the left, and the ruddy turnstone on the right. The range map for these two species is very similar, wintering down here but nesting way up there in the Arctic tundra. Some of the other notable, somewhat larger shorebirds that we see are oystercatchers and avocets and black-necked stilts. The oystercatchers are relatively rare in our area because, unfortunately, we don't have that much oyster habitat here in the south part of the lagoon. Up further north, Mosquito Lagoon and on further north, there are more extensive oyster flats. Unfortunately, if we have many more summer times like this last one, where we had 100% mortality of oysters down in the southern part of the lagoon, it's really a challenge for oyster catchers. We've only got 2 family groups of oyster catchers in Martin County, and it's probably about the same around here. Avocets are great birds to see. The picture that I put in here is the way you see it in the wildlife shows on TV and all that sort of thing. Real showy birds. They're nested way up north. They're here in the wintertime, but they change the plumage to that very gray and black and white. Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge is a great place to see them during the wintertime. Stilts, another real showy bird, another one that you'll recognize right away because of those long legs and black where it's black and snow white where it's white. The plovers are kind of a subgroup of the shorebirds, and I find them particularly interesting because I've had a couple of these projects with the piping plover. There are several different species you see here, and they're here at different times of the year, but generally we're able to identify them by the presence or absence of a neck band or necklace. Probably the most common of the plover family is killdeer. Not necessarily at the beach at all. You see them on golf courses and all over. But they're interesting. And the piping plover, I've done a couple of these different studies where we have indeed found a couple of them that are banded. And it's been very interesting because the bird is on the endangered species list. But well, that's kind of an oversimplification. There are several different populations of piping plovers. And based on the numbers in those populations, some of them are endangered and some of them are threatened. Well, here in Florida, you can't tell them apart by any means, but we have found some of these with the bands, and we've been able to track where they're from, and those that we have found in the Martin County area have all been banded up in part of the Great Lakes population. So Ludington State Park, this one, Sleeping Bear Dunes, if any of you are Michigan people up there further north in the main part of Michigan. And so it's interesting to learn about the migration patterns of the different populations or subpopulations of piping plovers. And when I reported our band sequence in to the folks, it's actually folks in Canada with the Ontario counterpart to our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that is dealing with the Great Lakes population. They were ecstatic to get the information about their birds down here because for the most part, that population is so small. There's only, the total population in all the Great Lakes is about 200 individuals. So every notification that they get is very helpful to them. So you see the odd kind of migration patterns where most of the ones from out there in the prairie potholes go down to the coast of Texas. Most of the ones up in New England come down to the islands. And we now know that some of the Great Lakes birds go to Texas and some come here to Florida. Willets are probably our next most common shorebird, longer-legged shorebird than the sanderlings and the ruddy turnstones. And I put this range map in to specifically remind me to talk about just how the length of the lagoon gives us different species at different times. Now, it's going to be hard to tell, but right there at Cape Canaveral is actually the break in the range for what is a year-round nesting area for willets to the north of that, and those that we see here very definitely are migrants. You know, you may see a straggler, one or two here during the summertime, but for the most part, they've gone all gone up north for the summertime breeding season. I don't want to mislead you that those are the only shorebirds. There are a whole bunch of other species. We just don't have time to get into them right now. They're less common, but often looking at the length of the bill and the size of the bird can give you some idea as to what species it is. Let's switch gears, though, to the raptors, because there's also a number of different species here. And for the most part, with a little bit of study, you can differentiate them based on plumage or size or the length of the tail or one thing or another. So I put in the graphics down here to give you an idea. Even if you don't see the plumage well, often the characteristics of the bird can help you at least get into the family that it is. We're just starting to see swallowtail kites back into the area. They returned maybe 3 weeks or so ago, and they'll nest in this area. I've highlighted in yellow the ones we're going to talk about, and let's start here with bald eagles, because certainly bald eagles are doing exceedingly well. We've got more in Florida now than, as you see here, more than in the entire lower 48 states, and they're doing real well. I pulled up a map here of the nest locations of bald eagles in Brevard County. And you see, you want to tie that to the Indian River Lagoon? Absolutely. You know, bald eagles are fish eaters, so they're going to be, you know, they will nest around lakes where they're going after larger fish. But right here, it's the fish in the IRL that are their primary food source. So as we're having these water quality problems, and as Dr. LaPointe and others are documenting the decline of the whole food chain, you know, we're starting with the plankton, we're moving up the food chain, and yes, we're starting to see it with the fish as well. I expect for the next several years, we're going to have very dismal nesting seasons for bald eagles. Ospreys are another kind of interesting species because we kind of take them for granted. They're around here during the wintertime, but there are some that are year-round residents as well. So I've had a number of projects over the years where I've worked with scout groups and others to put up osprey nesting platforms. They're doing real well. But if you think about that bird that is catching its prey based on eyesight, when the water's nice and clear like it is here, they're going to be able to find those mullet right up near the surface. As we get those discharges from Lake Okeechobee and other things and the water turns to mud, if the bird can't see 3 inches down, it's hard-pressed for them to get their meals. I put in one here about peregrine falcons because we do see peregrines in the IRL. I was doing a bird banding study a number of years ago, and it was interesting that many of the hawks will use that sand ridge that runs right along the western side of the Indian River Lagoon, the old beach dune. The prevailing southeasterly breezes are coming off the IRL. They're hitting that sand dune. There's a little bit of a lift there, and those migratory hawks are just using that as their flyway going north and south. So we got a couple peregrines that day, as well as sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawks and others. So we do see them. They usually arrive here in the IRL about September, and some of them migrate on down to Central and South America, but we see some here throughout the wintertime. And I put in the chart down there at the bottom to just show how well they have done. This is the species that, for those of you who may not remember, was decimated by the effects of DDT in the environment back in the 70s. It caused, I always get tongue-tied with this, egg shell thinning. The DDT and its breakdown products ended up interfering with the ability of the female bird to lay down a nice, thick, calcified egg. It would be so thin that as she would nest, incubate, she would break the eggs. So DDT was banned back in the 70s, and they started looking at all the different things that were affecting peregrine nesting success. And now, as you see, the population has increased so much that they've been taken off of the endangered species list. There's nothing better than to take a species off because it has exceeded the historical population size. We're not going to talk much about owls, but we got a bunch of different species here, and they're great birds. I've got a screech owl in nest box in my backyard, and he just started calling here about a week or so ago, so it's getting to be nesting season for them. Blackbirds and blackbirds. Out of all of them that are on here, the only one that's really a blackbird is the red-winged blackbird, but there are all these other ones that can indeed confuse people, and there are some others as well. I've got the boat-tail grackle up here, the male with his long boat tail, and the female over there a little bit more brown. There's common grackles, and it's a crow here in the middle. Brown-headed cowbirds and starlings, and this is kind of an interesting bird that I did get on some bird surveys that I was doing in Palm Beach County last year. This is an ani, for any of you who are crossword puzzle people. Often they're in there, A-N-I. It's kind of an interesting tropical bird, real raucous kind of a call, but fun birds to see. Don't really know what the deal is with their range, though. They're certainly not very common. Finch-billed Seedeaters. The cardinal is one that everybody knows, but we also get these buntings, the painted bunting, the most colorful of them. I was given this presentation in the school a while ago, and I asked if anybody in the class knew what that bird was. And one little kid, yeah, he was shaking his hand, so I called on, and he said, yeah, it's a rainbow bird. Well, I looked at it, red, orange, green, blue, indigo, violet. I mean, how could I tell him he was wrong? So painted buntings are interesting. They are migrants. They're interesting because they will come to feeders and they have enough wintertime site fidelity, which is kind of an interesting thing. We think for the most part, birds that winter here, they just move around wherever it's best to get their food. Well, if you're putting up the right kind of feeder and the right kind of food and doing so on a consistent basis, you can get these. I'm not going to spend much time on warblers because like some of these others, it's really challenging to identify them. As you see the quote here from Roger Torrey Peterson, and it takes years of study, and probably even more so here because we don't see them for that much of the year. A variety of different species, though. The two that I've highlighted over on the right, though, lower right, are ones that I did highlight because they're different from the others as far as their nesting habits and habitats. The upper one is the pine warbler, and it is a bird, a warbler that does nest here. Most of the others are migrants. Likewise, with the little common yellowthroat, another one that has just started singing maybe a month or so ago, and they're going to be nesting here for the summertime. Our most common of the warblers, though, is this guy here called the yellow-rumped warbler. certainly gets its name, but it's one of the ones that changes its plumage during different times of the year. So you look in the bird book at a yellow-rumped warbler, and usually the bird books will show you the nice showy plumage during the summertime nesting season. Well, that's not how we see them here. I had an interesting project a couple years ago with the yellow warbler. And I've seen yellow warblers up there in Maine back many years ago and didn't know that much about them. I hadn't ever seen one here in Florida. But I had an interesting project on the island of Barbados. And I was called down there along with a part of a team to go in, and we were doing sort of an ecological analysis on the last remaining mangrove swamp on the entire island of Barbados. They had dredged and filled everything else, and now they were trying to figure out how could they prevent this last little remnant that they had from being completely obliterated. And it just so happens that my part of this team was dealing with the yellow warbler. And I knew the one from up here in North America, but as I had to learn more about it, I find out that there is a subspecies of the yellow warbler that lives only in Barbados. It flew back and forth, or, you know, for previous generations of it, flew back and forth. One time they got down to Barbados and they said, hey, we like it here. Let's not fly 2,000 miles back up north. So they have been nesting there in this mangrove swamp. They have then been inbreeding with the relatively small population. So now they look a little bit different. You see the one with the some more kind of chestnut on its head, and it's even got a little bit of a Bayesian twang to it. It sounds a little bit different than our yellow warblers from up here. So I bring it up to you in context here of the whole situation of global warming. It turns out we do have a subspecies of yellow warbler that nests down in the Keys. And it could well be that one of the positive effects of the whole global climate change thing is that some of the species that have been further south are starting to move their way up. So I haven't found one of the Florida subspecies up here in the IRL, but I expect it won't be too many more years if people like all of you are out looking for them that will identify and be able to document them moving up this way. Oh yeah, one of the challenges for yellow warblers, you guys know about cowbirds? I showed you that picture of a cowbird before, that blackbird. That is what they call a nest parasite. The cowbird will go lay its eggs in the nest of a yellow warbler. And the yellow warbler female she hasn't gotten on to what's going on. So she will indeed raise those young, and often because that bird is so much bigger, as you see the one large mouth there in the nest, it's going to beg for and get more of the food. So in the long term, there's a variety of things that are causing challenges for yellow warblers. Sparrows, we're not going to talk in any detail about them either, because there are quite a few different species and they are very hard to identify. And again, often it's because we're seeing them here during the winter time. You know, they're seed eaters, so you know, they've been up north in other times of the year. They're here in the winter time. And not only is their plumage more dull, but also they're quiet. So birds that have beautiful melodious songs during the nesting season, if they're here, you know, they may chip if somebody disturbs them, but you're not going to likely be able to identify them by their calls. Yes, I put in this one of the dusky seaside sparrow. This is about all you're ever going to see of one. That's actually in a display case up at Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. And as you see from the graphic here, this is a species that has become extinct. The range of it had been up there in the kind of Titusville, Cape Canaveral area in the St. John's Marsh. So just like we have not been able to prevent dusky seaside sparrows from going extinct, there's another species that we're being challenged with right now. That's the grasshopper sparrow. A lot of research being done on that species that's out there in the kind of Kissimmee Prairie sort of a habitat. So that kind of takes us through a variety of the different species. I'm going to talk a little bit about migration here. And I've mentioned it on a few of the species, but it's really a pretty amazing thing as you learn more about the movement patterns of some of these birds. I have never seen an Arctic tern in the IRL, but just take a look at the graphic here of how that bird travels over 10,000 miles each way every year, back and forth and back and forth. Another one that I found interesting, I showed you that picture of the blackpoll warbler that I'd seen over on Indian River County beaches a few years ago. This is an interesting one because its southerly migration route is different from when it goes up north. So these birds launch from way up here. They fly over the open ocean, as you see here, over 2,000 miles. And there's no place to land out there. So these birds, when they take off, it is a one-time shot. Either they make it or they don't. On the return trip, though, it's interesting because the bird, even though it's been feeding very well down there during the winter time, as it's headed back up north, it says, no, I'm not going to go over the ocean that much. And so you see the range here, which is primarily through Florida. Some over the Yucatan Peninsula and then north, and some further to the west, but most of them right up through the coast. So indeed, when I saw the one over there on the beach, it was springtime, April, I think. There's a lot of interesting work being done right now on the migration patterns of the different species. We're learning a lot by banding birds and satellite transmitters and all that sort of thing. So I put in this one on the right. It's a radar satellite from just a couple days ago, Monday, April the 14th. You know that stuff when you're watching on TV and the meteorologists talk about that ground clutter? And they say that's not ground, it's not rain, it's ground clutter. Well, for the most part, those are birds. And so you see that huge mass of thousands or tens of thousands of birds that have lifted off from Cuba, and they're headed up across the Florida Straits, coming to, some of them to the Keys, but one of the prime birding locations for those of you who are warbler watchers is up here at Fort DeSoto Park in the Tampa area. So these birds have left from Cuba or even further south, and they're headed north. Now is migration season. So Dennis, whether you did it intentionally or not, the timing for this talk is really great to encourage people to get out and see the warblers as they're moving through. Yeah, occasionally we do see dead birds during migration. Migration's tough. You think about that bird flying thousands of miles. I urge you, if you see a dead bird someplace, do roll it over, kick it over, take a look on its legs for a band. Many of them are banded. I've turned in a bunch of these. You can now go online. You just report the number sequence, and you can find out about they'll send you information about where and when it was banded. So this particular royal tern had been banded back in 2006. And indeed, we get royal terns here during the wintertime, but these were birds that had nested up here in the outer banks of the Carolinas. Birds are having a variety of challenges. We're not going to dwell on them in great detail, but indeed, when you look at some of the long-term research, Billy Wagner was telling me of some of the work in Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge that unfortunately is documenting a continued decline in many of the species there at Pelican Island. It's a variety of reasons. You know, humanity is modifying their habitat. Certainly, we're finding dead birds that fishermen aren't intentionally getting them, but we see a lot of birds tangled in fishing line. Down at it's a pelican there on the left that has unfortunately caught that one. In Martin County, we're having a very interesting challenge right now. This is this bird island that I talked about, relatively small island. And as I was doing this monitoring for the better part of a year, although the target was to document the number of each species that was nesting there, the county, who was my client on this, asked me to go ahead and to also document any sort of disturbance to the birds. So I faithfully did that, and unfortunately it turned out to be 27% of my visits, there was some sort of an intrusion within these series of signs that have been placed around the perimeter of the island saying, please stay away, don't come in and disturb the birds. Well, so I think it's because of that, and there was no one group. There were tour guides from a wildlife eco tour, there was kayak groups, there were commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, just all kinds of things. And so I think it's overall that wanton disregard that has prompted the county to push for designation of what they call a critical wildlife area. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has not designated a new area as a critical wildlife area in over 20 years, and we're pushing their buttons right now, and I'm afraid I'm not sure how it's going to go. The fishermen and the wildlife operator have said, yes, go ahead and put those signs up, but we want an exemption that will allow us to continue doing what we've been doing. Well, I'm not sure how all that's going to work out, but it's already been deferred from one FWC commission agenda to the next, and we'll see what happens. Certainly those of you who were around this summer, you know about what in Martin County we've categorized as the lost summer. The water quality in the IRL was so horrendous. We had seagrass die off and oyster die off and everything else. And certainly that's going to have a long-term effect on the birds. Yes, the water's nice and pretty now, but we've lost a lot of the seagrass and sort of the basic trophic levels here that are going to feed up to support those nesting birds. So I won't be surprised if this coming year we see fewer individuals. Luckily, I guess if there is a positive side, most of the effects of those discharges were later in the nesting season. If you think about it, although I was talking about those birds nesting on the rooftop in the summer, if you think about the nesting season for birds in Florida, for the most part it's right now April, May, and June. If the birds have not evolved to be smart enough to have fledged their young by hurricane season, those species aren't around anymore. So by the time we got these discharges from Lake Okeechobee and we really started having the extensive problems with water quality in the southern IRL, it was later in the summer. So most of the birds had indeed fledged. I was continuing to do the bird surveys, and indeed we had some times where there were youngsters stranded in the nest. The adults were able to fly off, they go someplace else. But the youngsters that were unable to fly yet, I mean, they were tied there, and I'm sure there was a higher mortality rate. So I've mentioned a little bit about population changes. We're going to close here with ways that any of you can get involved with this. I think one of the things that I think is interesting about the whole bird side of things is there's a lot of citizen science related to it. Christmas bird counts is one of the ways. If you know about the Christmas bird counts, there's a very standardized protocol. Everybody goes out during a pre-designated day sometime between the middle of December and early January. And the idea is that there are established count circles, 7.5 miles in radius, and you get this team of people, however many you can recruit. And the idea is or the goal is to identify and count every individual of every species of bird. And while there are certainly challenges, you know, you're not going to see as many owls and that sort of thing, the idea is that over a long period of time, you do get very good data about trends of what's going on. So here for the IRL, I pulled up a map of the count circles in our area, and there are quite a few of them. There's 6 different ones. And so if you're interested in all this, you can get involved with that, and typically you want to try to go with other people who really know the birds well, but you don't need to be an expert birder for all this. And because that was providing so much information during the winter time, there is a new thing that just started up a few years ago, in 1997 here, something called the Great Backyard Bird Count. And they were recognized, this is a consortium, Audubon and Cornell Lab of Ornithology, probably the 2 main spearheads for it. But the idea is there are a lot of people who don't want to give up part of their Christmas holiday to go out on a full day of birding. But this is to indeed engage people in just looking out at the birds in your backyard and reporting it all online. You can spend 15 minutes doing it. You can spend however much you'd like. But you see how this has grown over the years. Every one of those yellow dots is one of these backyard bird count areas. And so in the big picture now, over 9 million birds were documented when it was done earlier this year. What are we getting out of that? Some very interesting information. I didn't even put a slide in here about doves, but we're going to talk about one of them right now. Anybody know this one? Eurasian collared dove, yeah. And we started seeing them in Martin County maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And this is a species that does very well in urban kinds of settings. And so if my graphic works here, what you're going to see is the expansion of the range of this bird the species of bird over the last several years. There it is starting down here in the southeast US. As each year goes by, they're expanding their range further west and further north, and we're getting the darker green showing we're getting larger numbers around here. So we seem to dwell a lot on the species that are doing poorly. Well, this is one of the areas that we're finding out about some of the birds that are doing very well in urban kinds of settings. There are other research projects that are going on with specific species. I mentioned the folks that are doing the painted bunting work. Another species here on house, this is the topic of research is the house finch, another species that is also expanding its range. And I'm going to end here with birding destinations in the IRL, because there are a number of different places you can go. There's actually a booklet on, or a program called the Great Florida Birding Trail, and there's a booklet for for East Florida, and it identifies a whole number of different sites. I've just put a few of them in here, but in the booklet there's a map and a description of each individual site, how to get there, whether it charges any money, and what time of the year, and what you're apt to see, anything like that. So you can get a hard copy, but it's all online. It's a good way to find out places that you might not know about. So with that, we've got a Bonaparte gull that is stretching because it's tired, and we got a black-bellied plover in its winter plumage that is yawning, and I think that's my signal that... So thank you for your attention.